We're expecting, as you indicated, that any moment now, the families of the 14 soldiers are expected to arrive here at the Swartkops Air Force Base any moment now, as the remains of their loved ones have already lined up here for the official ceremony to get underway. And of course, many questions, and this is something that President Cyril Ramaphosa had mentioned to Parliament this afternoon, mentioning that many questions had been asked about the presence of South African troops in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And if we just go back a little bit, as today we pay tribute and honor these fallen soldiers, you'd recall that since 1998, South Africa had become involved in efforts to end the conflict that plagued the DRC, following the collapse of the post-colonial Zairean state, you'd recall. That was under Mabuto Sese Seko, you'd recall. And, South Africa had shown some sort of reluctance at the time to get military drawn into the civil war, which became regionalized in about 1996. And in 1998, the conflict had seen several SADC member states, specifically Angola, Namibia, as well as Zimbabwe, lining up in support of Sese Seko, with the rebel movements basically also supported. And eventually South Africa emerged as, the principal peace broker, and the peace process resulted, you recall at the time, in the drawing up of a transitional constitution and plans for elections. It's a long history to where we are at this particular point. But you would know, if you fast forward to 2023, that the SANDF was the 5th largest troop contributing nation in the UN's operation in the eastern DRC. And this is where these soldiers were. This is where these soldiers had been involved in peacekeeping operations. And of course, in December of 2023, the South African Development Community SADC mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo was deployed to support the government of that country to restore peace and security in the eastern DRC. But the emphasis has also been placed on, and perhaps South Africa should also note, or South Africans should also note, that this is not the first time that the country has been involved in peacekeeping operations. We've seen troop deployment in the DRC, notably Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Burundi as well. But here at Swartkops, the stage is set for that moment of grief and relief for these families who've long been waiting for the return of their loved ones to South African soil. And I just recall at the weekend, when we spoke to our correspondent in Uganda, because you'd recall that the remains had been transported from there to South Africa. There'd also been there, in total, there'd been 18, 14 from South Africa, 2 from Malawi, and 2 from Tanzania. Now, Tanzania and Malawi also having committed troops to the DRC. 2,100 of those troops, Tanzanian and Malawian, and South Africa committing 2,900 troops to that mission. You can feel a sense of grief as the families are expected in just perhaps under 30 minutes or an hour to arrive at the Air Force Base. We're expecting them to be transported in 2 buses, and we know earlier on this afternoon they had gone to the mortuary to identify the remains of their loved ones. President Cyril Ramaphosa, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, will of course today lead this ceremony. The coffins, of course, to be draped in the South African flag. That on its own, a badge of honor for these fallen soldiers. At this handing over ceremony, that will consist of 2 parts: the official handing over and the memorial service that will then get underway. If you've just joined us on SABC News, we're live from the Swartkops Air Force Base. The remains of the 14 South African soldiers killed in the Democratic Republic of Congo in the volatile East have returned home. Having been killed just last month after they had come under attack. And South African soldiers in the DRC as part of the Southern African Development Community Mission in the DRC and the UN Organization Stabilization Mission, which I mentioned earlier, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, that is MONUSCO, of course. South Africa has been a troop contributing country to MONUSCO since 1999, and they've lent their support to the SADC mission deployed in the region since 2023. Today, their remains are officially being handed over to their families. It's a moment of, perhaps one could say, some sort of closure. These families would have long wanted to know when their loved ones would be coming home, and we've quite come to understand at this point the intricacies or challenges that have been associated with this repatriation process, which has been marred by some delays and most definitely behind the scenes some very difficult negotiation. But they are finally home. They're to be handed over to their families today. And also given that this tragedy had taken place last month already, there would be a sense to bury their loved ones as soon as possible. A sense of relief in grief. And you recall that in fact, since the dawn of democracy, the South African government's commitment to peace and security on the continent had basically drawn the SANDF into involvement in these multinational peacekeeping operations. I mentioned some of those countries already where we've seen SANDF troop deployment to those countries for the attainment of peace and stability in those nations. And the Democratic Republic of Congo is none the different in this case. The President indicating a bit earlier on in Parliament as well that the decision to deploy is not taken lightly, especially when it puts our troops in harm's way. Those were the words of the President, Chief of the Armed Forces. And I think these families will take solace in knowing today that the Commander-in-Chief will be part of this ceremony to hand over these remains. In just... All right, you'll return to us once again, Onati, as soon as the families start to arrive at the Air Force base. We'll alert you to when they have. But for now, the remains of the 14 soldiers killed in the DRC have arrived at the Swartkorps Air Force Base for handover to their grieving families.